Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the chilling final days of Elizabeth I, the most famous queen of England. Picture this, the cold stone corridors of Richmond Palace, torchlight flickering on the walls like whispering ghosts, and at the center of it all, a queen stripped of glory and silks, left only with suffocating layers of makeup, a poisonous mask she had trusted for over 4 decades. In the mirror, it's not youthful beauty staring back, but her own ghostly reflection. You might smile and think, oh, I'd probably do just fine at the Tudor court. But trust me, you wouldn't last a day. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop a comment letting me know where are you watching from and what time is it right now where you live. I love the feeling of sharing these nights with fellow night owls all around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit back in your chair and let your imagination drift through time. Tonight, you're wandering the cold stone walls of 16th century England. Outside, the spring wind barely stirs the branches, but inside Richmond Palace, candlelight trembles across the face of a woman running from the truth of herself. That woman is Elizabeth I, the queen who single-handedly shaped an entire age, yet slowly wasted away beneath the suffocating mask of poisonous cosmetic. You see, power rarely kills with swords or spears. It corrodes, it eats away, and sometimes it mixes with lead and mercury pressed onto your skin every morning. Sound familiar? Like using filters on social media so often you forget your real face. Elizabeth was once the image of vitality and intellect. Born into chaos, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a father who killed wives in his hunger for a son, and a mother executed for treason in a case history still debates. At just 2 years old, Elizabeth saw her world erased. That first trauma may have carved a crack that never fully healed. Historians still argue how deeply those memories scarred her, but her life of constant suspicion and caution shows the shadow never let her go. As she grew, Elizabeth learned to weaponize her brilliance. Fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, she became untouchable in the game of words. But this was the Tudor court, where death could come from a glance. So every word she spoke was honed like a blade. Here's a strange detail. She often practiced in front of a mirror, not to admire herself, but to make sure her gaze could convince any rival they were facing someone undefeatable. Sounds a bit like a modern influencer, doesn't it? Then fate struck in 1562. Elizabeth I caught smallpox. Imagine it, a young queen once famed for porcelain skin, now bedridden, her face scarred. When she recovered, she hadn't just lost her beauty, she'd lost her key to power. In that era, beauty wasn't vanity, it was proof of God's favor. A queen with a pocked face was a curse. From then on, she turned to Venetian ceruse, white lead makeup, a path with no return. Picture the mornings, Elizabeth sitting for hours as her ladies painted layer after layer of lead onto her skin, one coat then another until her face became a porcelain mask. At first it worked. Foreign ambassadors once again admired the Virgin Queen's glow, but beneath, poison seeped into her blood, corroding her memory, nerves, and temperament. Modern scientists say a fraction of that dose would send a minor to the hospital. Elizabeth used it daily for 40 years. You might laugh. I worry my phone screen will ruin my skin. I'd never smear lead on my face. But honestly, would you walk into the world without filters or retouch apps? Elizabeth couldn't either. Over decades, she became an unchanging icon of beauty and power, but inside her body warped. Hair fell out, skin ulcerated, hands trembled uncontrollably. Servants reported violent fits of rage, throwing objects across the room, followed by days of silence. Historians still debate, was it her temper or the madness of heavy metal poisoning? Knowing when to stay quiet, we can serve the well and avoid releasing. Here's something eerie. She had special mirrors installed across the palace, warped or tinted, so her reflection always appeared softer, younger. Each day she looked and whispered to herself, "I'm still beautiful. I'm still powerful." Familiar again, like choosing the perfect selfie filter, except hers could kill. As age advanced, the mask thickened. Every morning, hours of lead, mercury, even powdered raw meat layered onto her face like a medieval collagen mask. The result, porcelain whiteness above a collapsing body. A Venetian envoy once reported her skin sometimes glowed faintly green, her voice trembling to the point of incoherence. But the court played along. Image was everything. Image was everything. Imagine the elaborate illusion, dimmed lighting in audience halls, foreign guests kept at a distance, and anyone who dared mention the Queen's age branded an enemy. Some said Elizabeth once looked into a mirror and saw her mother, Anne Boleyn, smiling back. Modern historians call it a hallucination from poisoning, but for a queen who tied power to beauty, that vision must have been pure nightmare. You might laugh again. Sounds like a horror movie crossed with a fashion show. True enough, and if Hollywood made it, Elizabeth would need her own makeup crew to cover the makeup that was killing her. In her final years, Elizabeth became a shadow, rarely seen in public, and when she was, hidden behind layers of fabric and blazing red wigs. They say she sometimes forgot the names of loyal courtiers who had served her for decades, broken conversations, fragments of thought, signs of a queen slipping away from herself. The strangest relic was a letter found later, her so-called suicide note. In it, Elizabeth admitted she knew she was poisoning herself but could not stop. She called it a beautiful kind of suicide. She even hinted that those around her encouraged it, letting her slowly die so the Tudor line could end without bloodshed. Historians debate its authenticity, but if real, it turns her death into a 40-year assassination. Still, truth is truth. Elizabeth herself dipped the brush and spread poison across her face each morning. Her death didn't arrive in one night. It came in layers. Of lead, of masks, of mirrors. And when she finally passed in 1603, the court erased everything. They hid the letter, buried the evidence, and crafted the legend of Gloriana, the queen who died serene, leaving behind a strong England. But, as you've just heard, the truth was far darker. If you could whisper one thing into Elizabeth I's ear, maybe you'd say, "Drop the filter, Your Majesty, it's killing you." But like many of us today, she couldn't. And so Elizabeth remains the tragic proof that sometimes the very thing we believe preserves beauty and power becomes the invisible blade that destroys us. You take a slow breath, letting your mind sink into the silence of an old Tudor palace. A candle still flickers, casting its light on the cold stone walls, and you can almost hear the hurried footsteps of courtiers echoing through the corridors. Elizabeth I is moving toward the end of her journey, and every moment at the close of the 16th century feels like a play both tragic and surreal. You realize that by the 1590s, Elizabeth was no longer the radiant queen with her striking red hair. She could barely walk on her own, needing to cling to railings or be guided by attendants. This isn't rumor. It's recorded in court chronicles that her health had severely declined. Yet strangely, instead of resting, Elizabeth only became busier. She summoned meetings constantly, sometimes lasting late into the night, as if she believed that if she stopped for even a single day, the whole empire would collapse. Sounds a bit like you staying up at 2 a.m. finishing a deadline, doesn't it? The only difference is, you poison yourself with coffee, while Elizabeth poisoned herself with white lead. Here's a little-known fact. During those years, she had an entire room of mirrors built at Whitehall, arranged with careful lighting so her reflection would always look softer and younger. Historians still debate the real purpose. Was it vanity or a political trick to convince foreign envoys the Queen was still strong and full of life? Either way, it shows Elizabeth was living in a half-real, half-illusion world, where mirrors were crafted to soothe a heart unwilling to face age. Step deeper into your imagination, a dark chamber, lit only by faint yellow candlelight on her face. Each morning, her ladies would bring boxes of powders and mercury-tinted rouge. They patiently layered it onto her skin like masons plastering an old wall. The eerie part was that once dry, the makeup cracked and flaked, forcing attendants to patch her face multiple times a day. One lady-in-waiting even joked it was less makeup and more a daily reconstruction project. You can't help but laugh. It sounds like an app crashing and needing constant restart. Meanwhile, England was facing famine, exhausting wars, and unending religious tension. And yet, the people still believed their queen was invincible. That's the key point. Elizabeth's image was as vital as her policies. Her mask of lead wasn't just vanity, it was a weapon of diplomacy. Historians still wonder, without that mask, would her authority have collapsed much sooner? The saddest part is that Elizabeth herself knew she was trapped. Some nights, in her solitude, she confessed to trusted courtiers that she felt bewitched by the mirror. These words don't appear in textbooks, but they survive in forgotten servant memoirs. Imagine it. A queen who once crushed the Spanish Armada now felt defeated by a mirror hanging on her wall. If that isn't tragedy, what is? By 1600, the signs of heavy poisoning grew obvious. Elizabeth often forgot the names of loyal servants, and sometimes lost her train of thought mid-speech in Parliament. Ambassadors wrote about these episodes. Few people know, though, that in her moments of confusion, she would whisper her mother's name. Anne Boleyn. The mother executed when she was a child. Was it dementia or a lifelong ghost of family trauma? Historians still argue. To sit there, feeling the weight in the air grow heavier, the court devised elaborate rituals to protect her image. Foreign envoys were required to keep a minimum distance so they couldn't see her trembling hands or gray skin. Think about it. Like a celebrity today using dim lighting and live streams to hide wrinkles. Only back then, the stakes were far higher. An entire dynasty depended on this trick of light. There's a curious story. During one ceremony, Elizabeth's wig nearly slipped off in front of the crowd. A lady-in-waiting rushed to fix it and everyone pretended not to notice. If that happened today, it would have gone viral as a meme. But in Tudor England, it was a state secret. The chilling part is that Elizabeth seemed to know exactly what was happening. At times, she whispered that she was committing suicide in layers. A secret letter later found only confirmed this. She knew the cosmetics were killing her, but she couldn't stop. Some even speculate her courtiers encouraged it, letting her fade slowly so the Tudor dynasty could end without bloodshed. Whether the letter was authentic remains debated, but the theory is haunting. Now think about it. If you lived your whole life in court, who could you trust? Not your mirrors, not your attendants, not even your own body. Elizabeth, the queen who once made Europe tremble, ended up sitting alone in a dark chamber, whispering to the ghosts of her past. And then, in March of 1603, she breathed her last. Everyone knows this event. The death of Elizabeth marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, but few recall the final detail. In her last moments, she asked for a mirror. None dared to hand her one. They say she touched her cheek with her fingers, which came away smeared with poisonous white makeup. That was the last image of Europe's most dazzling queen. He might laugh again. It's like the end of a horror movie, when the character still worries about her makeup before dying. But inside that laugh lingers an unease that won't fade. And so the court moved quickly to bury the truth, weaving the story that Elizabeth died peacefully. Historians still debate, was it political cover-up, or an attempt to preserve the national pride tied to her image? You and I both know. The truth was far darker. You take another slow breath, and realize perhaps Elizabeth was a mirror for us all, always chasing immortality in an image, but sometimes it is that very chase that kills the most living part of us. You close your eyes gently, imagining the wind whistling through the narrow windows of Richmond Palace. Outside, dawn is breaking, but inside the chamber where Elizabeth lies, only heavy silence remains. Can you feel it? The air is like the aftermath of a feast, just the faint smell of burnt-out candles and a cup of wine gone cold. After her death, the court quickly dressed the truth in finery. Official records claimed the Queen passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by loyal attendants. Yet if you had been sitting in the corner of that room, you would know it wasn't so serene. Her body was deformed by years of lead and mercury, her skin broken, her wig tangled on the pillow, her lips trembling as if to whisper one final word. Historians still debate, was it truly mirror as legend says, or only a sigh too faint to understand? And evidence suggests that the words preceded once. Few know this. When royal physicians prepared her body for burial, they spent hours scraping away makeup as thick as plaster. Some said the powder fell off in chunks, revealing green-gray skin, hardly human anymore. It sounds horrifying, but really, it was like peeling off a face mask left on too long. Except this mask had been worn for 40 years straight. Afterward, James III took the throne, founding the Stuart dynasty. He immediately ordered every trace hidden. Elizabeth's supposed farewell letter vanished into royal archives. Reports of her failing health were burned. A new legend was built. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, passing peacefully, leaving England strong. Historians still argue fiercely, was this a clever political strategy or one of Europe's most successful cover-ups? You step out of the imagined corridors and reflect on how power always needs myths to survive. Elizabeth wore a mask her whole life, and even in death, the court covered her face with a gentler story. Strangely enough, the image of the Queen who never aged became immortal, painted into portraits, praised in poems, sung in ballads. The truth beneath the rouge was quietly forgotten. One overlooked detail: in many of Elizabeth's final portraits, artists were ordered to paint her young, her skin smooth and white, free of wrinkles. Art historians still debate whether that was her personal request or a political command to preserve the nation's image. Imagine if Instagram existed back then. Elizabeth's feed would have been flawless, never a no-makeup selfie, and you'd probably laugh. Wow, this queen really knew how to work a filter. But the story lingers into our present. Today we have an entire beauty industry, thousands of products, countless editing tools. You might ask yourself, are we so different from Elizabeth? Or are we too chasing an image that isn't real? Trading away inner peace for someone else's approval? You smile softly. Well, at least our cosmetics don't have lead anymore, right? True, but the pressure to maintain a perfect image hasn't changed much since Tudor times. Elizabeth I is gone, yet her legacy endures. She made England a naval power, defeated the Spanish Armada, opened a golden age of Shakespeare and explorers. That's the official history we all know. But if you listen closely, there's another sound. The quiet sigh of a woman who sacrificed everything to preserve an image. And that, perhaps, is the deeper lesson you carry away tonight. You let out a breath, this time a gentle one. Elizabeth's story feels like a soft reminder. Power, beauty, fame. These are only thin layers of paint. What remains in the end is the courage to face yourself. Now let your body grow still. Hear the steady hum of the fan, and imagine the last candle in the Queen's chamber finally going out. Sleep is coming, slowly, like the footsteps of time, closing the long story of Elizabeth I. A tale as beautiful, sorrowful, and strange as the Queen herself. You're still sitting there, picturing the last candle in Richmond Palace flickering out. But the story doesn't end with Elizabeth's death. In truth, when a queen dies, the court is never allowed to mourn for long. Everything has to follow a pre-written script. Who will succeed, how the funeral will be staged, and most importantly, how to convince the people that the kingdom is still secure. And so, only a few days after Elizabeth drew her final breath, the new king was announced. James VI of Scotland, now James I of England. Imagine it. Two kingdoms that had fought countless wars now suddenly sharing a single ruler. It was like two neighbors who'd hated each other since childhood, suddenly being forced to live under the same roof. In theory, it sounded noble. England and Scotland united under one crown. In reality, there was suspicion, hesitation, and no shortage of side-eye glances. Elizabeth's funeral was nothing short of grand. Her coffin, draped in crimson velvet and gold crosses, was carried through the streets of London as church bells thundered. Crowds lined both sides of the road, many weeping openly. Strange, isn't it? A queen once infamous for being ruthless, suspicious, even punishing her own courtiers. Yet in death, she drew tears from her people. But that's the magic of legend. No one remembered her rages or the mornings she trembled before her mirror. What remained in collective memory was good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and kept England steady through decades of religious turmoil. If you think about it, this is one of history's great paradoxes. The more shadows that get hidden, the brighter the legend shines. Elizabeth's death was like hitting delete on the messy cachet of truth, keeping only the polished version. Sound familiar? Like deleting all the embarrassing photos in your phone, leaving just the one perfect selfie to post online. James the Iron stepped onto the throne with a very different aura. He didn't have Elizabeth's mythic halo, but he did have a grand ambition to consolidate royal power and, yes, you guessed it, unite England and Scotland into one nation. The problem was, James lacked Elizabeth's talent for theater. He was blunt to the point of clumsiness, often abrupt in speech, and had the peculiar habit of being terrified of knives. People said that whenever he saw a bare blade, he shuddered, haunted by the assassination plots his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had endured. Picture it. A king who breaks into a sweat at the sight of a dagger. Hardly majestic. But don't forget, history doesn't always need majesty. It craves stability, and James, at least at first, provided that. He ordered Elizabeth's legend to remain untouched. No one was to speak of her poisoning, and certainly no one was to mention that strange farewell letter. Instead, the Stuart court crafted an image of an immortal Elizabeth, in portraits, in poems, in solemn commemorations. Her death was staged as serene and noble, not as the humiliating decline it really was. You see, this story offers a timeless lesson. Power isn't only about how you rule, it's about how you're remembered. Elizabeth, whose body was destroyed by her own cosmetics, received one final makeover in death, this time not with lead or mercury, but with endless praise. And because of that, she became the icon of England's golden age. When you hear Shakespeare, Francis Drake, or the Armada's defeat, you think of Elizabeth. The cracked layers of powder, the nights of ghostly hallucinations, those were buried in silence. Back to James I, he leaned heavily on that legacy to secure his own rule. The people were told Elizabeth died peacefully, leaving a prosperous realm, and that James was her rightful continuation. Look closely, and you'll see it for what it was. A large-scale PR campaign. You thought political spin was a modern invention? The Tudors and Stuarts had already mastered it. Ironically, once Elizabeth was gone, people began to miss her more. The public, who had once grumbled about her temper and old age, now found James I could never measure up to good Queen Bess. It was like trading in your old reliable phone for a new one with weak battery life and constant glitches. Suddenly, the old one didn't seem so bad after all. History embroidered the tale further. Elizabeth became the eternal Virgin Queen, a figure held up as a model for future queens and a benchmark against which lesser kings would always be compared. And if you've been paying attention, you'll notice something. In tonight's story, Elizabeth isn't just a historical figure, she's a mirror. She lived her whole life behind masks of lead powder, warped mirrors, carefully staged lighting. We today may not smear lead on our faces, but we wear other masks, Instagram filters, curated Facebook posts, the phrase "I'm fine" when inside we're not. The only difference is that our masks rarely kill the body, but sometimes they erode the soul. As you breathe slowly, listening to this tale, you might sense the eerie parallel. What Elizabeth feared most wasn't the enemy outside, but the truth inside the mirror. And maybe, for many of us today, that fear hasn't changed. Elizabeth's death closed a dynasty, but opened a haunting question. How much does image matter more than truth? For Elizabeth I, the answer was clear. Image mattered so much, she was willing to sacrifice health, memory, even her very spirit. For us, maybe the question still lingers. You sigh gently, just as Elizabeth once did. And you realize this long story isn't only about a queen long gone. It's whispering to you. Be careful with the masks you wear. They can make you a legend in others' eyes, but they can also strip away the most alive parts of yourself. And now, as the night deepens and the fan hums steadily, you can let your body rest. The story of Elizabeth I ends here, but its echo lingers like a thin layer of dust on a page, reminding you that power, beauty, and legend are all just layers of powder that time will brush away. The only thing left is the truth you dare to face in the mirror, no matter how uncomfortable the reflection may be. You can still feel the echo of Elizabeth I's death, like a trail of candle smoke that hasn't yet faded. But history never allows a void. One dynasty closes, and immediately another begins. And so, in March of 1603, James VI of Scotland was crowned, becoming James I of England. Think of it as an arranged marriage. The English were conservative, used to Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, both fearsome and revered. The Scots were proud that their king suddenly wore a second crown. On paper, it was a moment of national unity, but in reality, you know how it is. Two families that have quarreled for centuries don't suddenly live happily under the same roof. Resentment lingers. James I was an unusual figure. Unlike Elizabeth, he lacked glamour or star power. People described him as awkward, with a stumbling gait, a heavy Scottish accent that many Englishmen found hard to understand. He had the habit of speaking too bluntly, without diplomatic charm. If Elizabeth was a master actress, wielding her gaze and words like weapons, James was more like an absent-minded professor, bright in theory but clumsy on stage. And you know, the English court had grown accustomed to their theatrical queen, so when they saw a king who dressed a bit sloppily, limped slightly, or jumped at loud noises, they whispered, "Can this man really hold the crown?" Yet James is no fool. Raised in Scotland's ruthless political climate, he learned early that plots and betrayal were daily bread. His father was assassinated when he was just a baby. His mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was imprisoned and executed by the English. Tragedy from the cradle. A child raised among daggers and shadows has no choice but to learn survival. There's a curious anecdote. James V feared sharp blades. At banquets, he demanded tables be cleared of knives, sometimes even eating with his hands for safety. You might chuckle, a king eating like he's at a picnic. But if you'd watched your mother executed by the axe, perhaps knives would haunt you too. When James claimed the English crown, he announced his great ambition, to unite England and Scotland. A noble idea, but centuries of hatred don't vanish overnight. To the English, Scotland was a wild northern land. To the Scots, the English were arrogant oppressors. Two countries, one king sounded fine in speeches, but reality was another matter. In his first years, James faced suspicion on all sides. English nobles saw him as an outsider. The people longed for Elizabeth. The clergy worried he might favor Catholics, since his mother had been their martyr. You see, being king isn't about sitting on a throne, waiting for applause. It's more like being the CEO of a bankrupt company, with resentful employees and shareholders constantly comparing you to the legendary boss who just died. But James had one weapon: intellect. He wasn't handsome or majestic, but he was a true scholar. He devoured books, adored philosophy, and was fascinated, perhaps too much, by theology. He even wrote a treatise on witchcraft, demonology, declaring that demons were real and must be destroyed. Sound familiar? Yes. England's witch hunts were partly fueled by that book. You could say Elizabeth wore lead powder to maintain her power's mask, while James painted his image with theology, a king chosen by God. And James I left behind one cultural monument, the King James Bible. His commissioned English translation became a literary masterpiece, shaping language, culture, and even modern English style. You may never have read it cover to cover, but you've certainly heard its phrases: compact, musical, woven into everyday speech. So, awkward though he was, James still made his mark, but not always for the better. You remember the gunpowder plot of 1605? A group of Catholics plotted to blow up Parliament with the king inside. The scheme failed, and ever since, every November 5th, the English burn Guy Fawkes in effigy and light fireworks. You might smile. So England's fireworks tradition comes from a failed act of terrorism. History can be stranger than Hollywood. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's image lingered like a ghost. Though dead, she was everywhere. In paintings, in memory, in endless comparisons. People muttered, if good Queen Bess were alive, this wouldn't have happened. Poor James, forever measured against a legend. Like a new singer replacing a diva, no matter how well he performed, the audience still cheered the absent star. The Stuart court, desperate for stability, kept packaging Elizabeth in perfection. Her funeral became a symbol of unity. Her portraits showed her eternally young, pale, flawless. No one spoke of toxins or her trembling before the mirror. Official history said only, the Queen died peacefully, leaving behind glory. And you hearing this may wonder, is history nothing more than a giant retouched photo? Airbrushed highlights, cropped shadows, then posted for posterity. Reality is messy, brutal even, but collective memory keeps only what is easy to swallow. James III, whether he liked it or not, became part of that play. He inherited the crown, but Elizabeth's shadow loomed so large that every step he took was measured against her. And from this point, England entered a new chapter, the Stuart dynasty, destined for civil war, division, and the beheading of a king. But that is still to come. For now, picture London on the morning after Elizabeth I's death. Streets heavy with incense, people weeping and whispering, curious about their new king. And in that air, Elizabeth's presence still lingers. Half real, half illusion, both the queen of the past and the filter created by those who came after. You take a slow breath and feel sleep approaching. The story of Elizabeth I passing into James is like the river of time itself, always flowing, never stopping. And you, listening here, are simply an imagined witness, sitting beside the candlelight, hearing history whisper. Picture the morning after Elizabeth I's funeral. Incense still lingers over the streets of London, the sound of weeping mixing with hushed gossip, and in the middle of the crowd, a new name begins to rise: James I. To many it was a foreign name, spoken with a Scottish accent, carrying none of the aura of good Queen Bess. But like it or not, England now had a new king. James I entered the palace awkwardly, but his eyes were anything but naive. He had lived his whole life in the political shadows of Scotland, where even the smallest mistake could cost you your head. His father was assassinated when he was an infant, his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, executed by the English themselves. You see, James understood perfectly. A throne is never a cushioned chair. It's a rocking seat balanced on the edge of a cliff. From the very start, he faced a daunting problem: religion. The Tudors had left England divided by the Reformation, Catholics and Protestants like two underground fires, always ready to flare up. Elizabeth had danced on the tightrope, soothing one side, tightening her grip on the other. But James was different. He wanted the kingdom united under one faith, and that faith was Anglicanism. In 1604, the Hampton Court Conference brought the conflict into the open. Imagine it, a grand hall with carved wooden ceilings, light falling on the tense faces of Catholic, Puritan, and Anglican leaders. Heated arguments about worship, rituals, and church authority filled the air. James, the theology enthusiast, listened, then suddenly declared, "No bishop, no king." In other words, without bishops, there could be no monarch. It sounded simple, but it drew a line in the sand. James tied the crown's authority directly to the Church of England. To challenge the church was to challenge the throne itself. With one sentence, he turned religion into a matter of royal survival. Not everyone was pleased. Catholics, who had hoped the son of Mary Stuart might show them mercy, were disappointed. Puritans, who wanted harsher reforms, felt betrayed. Both sides grew restless. And that restlessness gave birth to one of England's most infamous plots, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Picture a band of radical Catholics, led by Robert Catesby, hauling barrels of gunpowder into the cellars beneath Parliament. Their plan was simple: blow up the king and his government, then restore a Catholic monarch. Among them was a name you surely know: Guy Fawkes. On the night before Parliament's opening, an anonymous letter reached the authorities. Soldiers searched the cellars and found Guy Fawkes sitting guard beside the barrels, match in hand. Imagine the scene. A dark underground chamber, heavy wooden casks, and a man caught red-handed with the fuse. The plot failed, and November 5th became Bonfire Night. Every year, the English lit fireworks and burned effigies of Guy Fawkes in celebration. You might laugh. So the firework tradition comes from a failed act of terrorism. History does love its dark ironies. Afterward, James tightened his religious policies. He couldn't risk Catholicism becoming a rallying point again. But here was the paradox. The harsher his measures, the deeper the resentment grew. Every ruler faces this puzzle: how to keep order without driving discontent into rebellion. Religion wasn't his only challenge. Politics and money weighed heavily. Compared to the great empires, England was still poor. The treasury was drained by wars and royal spending. Yet James, who enjoyed extravagance, spent freely. He loved grand feasts, hunting trips, and especially lavishing gifts on his favorites. Some of these favorites became notorious at court, whispered about as both companions and lovers. Picture the Stuart court, night-long banquets, wine flowing like rivers, music swelling while the king raised his cup and recited theology. Entertaining for courtiers, perhaps, but for peasants starving after failed harvests, it was a slap in the face. And so the murmurs of discontent grew louder. Yet James left behind something enduring: the King James Bible, 1611. He commissioned scholars to produce an English translation that was clear, majestic, and poetic. The result was a linguistic masterpiece, shaping English for centuries. Many of the crisp musical phrases you hear in modern English trace back to this text. If Elizabeth gave England Shakespeare, James gave them the King James Bible. Still, Elizabeth's ghost hovered. Whenever people grew dissatisfied with James, they sighed for good Queen Bess. They forgot the lead paint and mirror-born nightmares, and remembered only the Armada's defeat and glittering pageantry. collective memory, as always, knew how to edit the past into an album of golden snapshots. Listening now, you may realize power is always a performance. Elizabeth played the eternal queen behind her white mask. James tried to play the scholar king, though often stumbling into ridicule. In the end, it's the audience, the people, who decide which role remains in memory. The 17th century began with light and shadow intertwined. James I opened the Stuart dynasty, laying the groundwork for English-Scottish unity. But at the same time, he sowed the seeds of future storms, religious strife, political resentment, and the endless tug-of-war between crown and parliament. He breathed slowly, feeling the air thicken like in the halls of Westminster, where lawmakers argued, where the gunpowder cellars still smelled faintly of smoke, and where Elizabeth's phantom lingered, casting her long shadow over every decision James made. And you see the truth. History is never a straight line. It's a series of masks, applied, stripped away, then painted anew. Elizabeth wore white lead. James wore the Bible and philosophy. Both, in their own ways, tried to craft images strong enough to cover the cracks beneath. You lean back, listening to the soft hum of the fan. The story isn't finished, because after James, England will face storms far fiercer, battles over power, freedom, and faith, storms strong enough to topple a crown. But that is a tale for another night. You can still picture the smoke of the gunpowder plot drifting through your imagination. But England didn't stop at celebrating victory. Almost immediately, a larger question loomed. Who truly held power in the kingdom? The king, with his throne said to be ordained by God? Or Parliament, filled with nobles, merchants, and lawyers who were growing wealthier and more self-assured every year? James I entered this struggle with absolute conviction. The king was supreme. He often repeated the doctrine he believed in, the divine right of kings. Imagine him standing before Parliament, his thick Scottish accent rolling out. The king is the living image of God on earth. In plain terms, to oppose the monarch was to oppose God. It sounded grand, but put yourself in the shoes of the MPs. Who wants to be a puppet paying heavy taxes to a court while real authority rests in one man's hands? And so, from the early 1600s, relations between James and Parliament grew tense as a drawn bowstring. Money was the greatest source of conflict. James spent freely, loved parties and hunting, and showered his favorites with lands, titles, and pensions. The treasury ran dry. Each time he was short of funds, he turned to Parliament for new taxes, and as you know, asking for money is never easy. Parliament began to use finance as leverage. They agreed to grant new revenues only if the king made concessions, reforming policies protecting merchants or curbing extravagance. James bristled. To him it was like children trying to bargain with their father. He snapped. A king cannot be held to ransom by his subjects. But Parliament was no longer the medieval rubber stamp. This was the age of trade, of shipping, of merchants with wealth, and they no longer intended to bow and obey. In 1610, there was a fascinating episode called The Great Contract. Think of it like a business negotiation. Parliament offered James a fixed annual income in exchange for him giving up certain outdated feudal rights. On paper, it made sense, but James grew suspicious. He feared that once he depended on Parliament's fixed allowance, his freedom would be shackled. After endless wrangling, the deal collapsed, and the gulf between king and MPs widened further. Religion added more fuel to the fire. James tried to balance, but neither Catholics nor Puritans were satisfied. Puritan members of Parliament demanded deeper reforms, stripping away every trace of popish ceremony. James refused, believing too much reform would bring chaos. So the speeches of protest multiplied in the chamber, and James answered with his own speeches. long, winding lectures on royal authority. You can picture MPs stifling yawns, sneaking glances at the hourglass while the king droned on. In foreign policy too, James stirred controversy. He sought peace with Spain, the same Spain that Elizabeth I had gloriously defeated. To him, war was costly, peace was wise, but to many Englishmen, raised on tales of the Armada's defeat, compromise smelled like weakness. They whispered, good Queen Bess would never have tolerated Spain. Elizabeth's shadow still pressed heavily on him. There's an odd detail. James loved hunting so much he sometimes skipped critical sessions of state to ride out after deer. Furious MPs nicknamed him the Deer Hunter King. But in James's mind, hunting wasn't just sport, it was a royal metaphor. The king as hunter, the people as the herd needing guidance. It sounds lofty, but imagine a kingdom drowning in debt while its monarch galloped through the woods. How must that have looked to ordinary subjects? Life at the Stuart court had its own scandals. James was famous for his intimate attachments to handsome young favorites, showering them with power and wealth. People gossiped, Parliament murmured, but James didn't hide it. To him, friendship, or more than friendship, was a form of politics. He entrusted those he adored, ignoring the whispers. You see, royal scandals that sound modern actually thrived in the 17th century too. While James indulged his passions, Parliament grew bolder. They began to see themselves as a true counterweight. Some MPs openly criticized royal policy, something few had dared under Elizabeth, and James, though enraged, couldn't simply cut off heads anymore. The times had changed. Listening now, you can feel the tension thickening. It was like a house where floorboards creak and the roof begins to leak. The master keeps hanging tapestries and painting the walls, but everyone knows one strong storm could bring the whole place down. And indeed, the Stuart dynasty would soon face real storms, civil war, a king executed, even the birth of a short-lived republic. But the seeds of all that were sown under James I, in arguments with Parliament, in half measures of policy, and in the immense shadow of Elizabeth I that he could never escape. He breathed slowly, letting the hum of the fan blend with the rhythm of the story. The tale of James I is not finished, for the conflicts he left behind would erupt with ferocity under his son, Charles I. But that belongs to another chapter, for another night. For now, remember this: power, no matter how sacredly it is dressed, always rests on human consent, and when that consent fractures, a throne is no longer a solid seat. It is only a rocking chair, trembling in the wind. Imagine it. When James I died in 1625, the mood across the kingdom was like a banquet, where the lights had just been turned off. People did not mourn as deeply as they had for Elizabeth I, for James had never been so beloved, but his death still left a void. And immediately the next heir stepped forward, Charles I, James's second son. Charles was not the kind of man who made crowds cheer. He was short, spoke with a slight stammer, and often seemed uneasy when addressing the public. Yet he had something his father lacked, a calm, gentlemanly elegance. He loved art, collected paintings, and was known for his refined fashion sense. Interesting, yes, but as you know, in that age a king needed far more than taste. From the very start, Charles made a grave mistake. He married Henrietta Maria, a Catholic princess of France. Picture it, a nation already raw from religious tension, still haunted by the Gunpowder Plot, now welcoming a Catholic queen into its palace. The people grew fearful, Parliament grew resentful, and Anglican clergy frowned. Suspicion followed Charles from the very first moment. Would he lead England back into Rome's embrace? But Charles was not a man of compromise. He inherited from his father the belief that the king held absolute power, chosen by God himself. To him, Parliament was not a partner, but a tool. And so began an inevitable chain of conflicts. Whenever he needed money for wars or court expenses, Charles had to summon Parliament. But Parliament, long practiced in using money as leverage, attached conditions: reform policies, limit royal authority, protect the interests of merchants. Charles turned red with anger. In his mind, a king must never be taken hostage by nobles and lawyers. Once, when Parliament refused his policies, Charles made a decision history still shakes its head at. He dissolved Parliament entirely. He locked the doors, sent the MPs home, and declared he would rule alone. The period became known as the 11 Years' Tyranny, 1629-1640. Imagine a CEO firing his entire board of directors and saying, "From now on, I make every decision myself." It sounds neat, until the explosion comes. To raise money without Parliament, Charles revived outdated feudal taxes and even imposed ship money on inland counties that had no ships at all. Farmers cried out, "We live nowhere near the sea. Why pay for a navy?" Yet Charles pressed on. Discontent spread. People grumbled not only about taxes, but also religion. Henrietta Maria's Catholic influence made the court suspect. Worse, Charles appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, a man favoring rituals that looked suspiciously Catholic. Puritans seethed, whispering, "Our king is dragging us back to Rome." Inevitably, the reckoning came. War with Scotland broke out, and Charles desperately needed funds. In 1640, he was forced to recall Parliament after 11 years. But the MPs, no longer docile, stormed back like lions unleashed. They denounced the king openly, listed his abuses, and demanded sweeping reforms. This became the Long Parliament, which lasted nearly 20 years and turned into Charles's deadliest adversary. Tension reached its breaking point when Charles committed a fatal blunder. He marched soldiers into Parliament to arrest several opposition members, but the MPs had already fled. Picture it, the king bursting in, furious, only to find empty chairs. From that moment, all bridges between Crown and Parliament were burned. Civil war erupted in 1642. England split in two: Royalists, the Cavaliers, loyal to the king, and parliamentarians, the Roundheads. Streets, villages, even families divided. Brothers could take up swords against each other for different sides. The English Civil War swept across the land like a storm. At first, Charles held the advantage. Nobles and horsemen rallied to him. But Parliament had what he lacked: financial backing from merchants, and above all, a commander named Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was no grand noble, but he had iron discipline and fierce religious zeal. He built the new model army, a force organized not around birth, but around merit and ideology. Battle by battle, Parliament gained ground. Charles, once convinced of his divine invincibility, was reduced to a fugitive, captured, escaping, recaptured. Each episode shattered his authority further. At last, in 1649, Charles I was brought to trial. Imagine the scene: a king seated in the dock, not before kneeling courtiers but stern-faced MPs. His charge: treason against the nation. To him it was absurd. How could a king betray his own kingdom? But to Parliament, he was no longer God's chosen. He was just a man who had broken the law. The trial ended with an unprecedented sentence: execution. Charles heard the verdict calmly. They say he walked to the scaffold in a plain white shirt, so no one would mistake his shivers in the cold for fear. And before laying his head upon the block, he whispered, "I am the lawful king of England. I die a good man." The axe fell, and a roar surged through the crowd. For the first time in English history, a king was publicly executed by his own people. You sit here, listening, and a chill runs down your spine. From Elizabeth I with her mask of white lead, to James with his endless lectures, to Charles with his unyielding belief in divine right, all ended in tragedy. The throne, it seems, was never a seat of rest, but always a chair, trembling over an abyss. After Charles's death, England entered a strange new chapter, a republic under Oliver Cromwell. But that is a story for another night. For now, take a slow breath and let your imagination settle. Remember, even those who wore crowns could not escape the shadow of truth. And perhaps the deepest lesson history whispers is this: power, when it knows no limit, will, sooner or later, sever its own head. After the blade fell on Charles I, England entered a chapter unlike any before. For the first time, the throne stood empty. No king, no crown. Instead, the nation became a republic, the Commonwealth of England, watched over by a man named Oliver Cromwell. Picture the moment. Monarchy, a system that had lasted for centuries, suddenly erased. The crown and scepter, glittering symbols of divine right, locked away. The House of Lords abolished. Even the Church of England, once tied so tightly to royal power, bent to Parliament's will. And at the center stood Cromwell, a country gentleman turned soldier, now the most powerful man in the realm. Cromwell was no ordinary ruler. He dressed simply, prayed constantly, and spoke with the fire of a prophet. To his followers, he was God's warrior, chosen to cleanse the land. To his enemies, he was a stern tyrant in plain clothes. Either way, no one could ignore him. Imagine London in those years. No royal pageantry, no glittering coronations, no sovereign riding through cheering crowds. Instead, sermons, soldiers in crisp formation, and Parliament struggling to govern a fractured land. For Cromwell, politics was never just politics. It was spiritual warfare. He believed England was God's new Israel, chosen to shine as a beacon of righteousness in a sinful world. But ruling was never easy. Without a king, divisions only deepened. Radicals demanded democracy. Royalists plotted to restore Charles's son. Even the army, once united, began pushing for its own political voice. The very forces that had toppled monarchy now threatened to tear the republic apart. At first, Cromwell resisted more power, but in 1653, frustrated with endless bickering, he lost patience. Soldiers marched into Parliament, and Cromwell thundered, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing. In the name of God, go." And just like that, England's brief experiment with free republican government was over. Cromwell became Lord Protector, a humble title but with near-royal authority. Backed by the army, he enforced strict Puritan morality. Theaters closed, festivals banned, even Christmas celebrations suppressed. Taverns and dancing frowned upon. To some, England felt less like a free commonwealth and more like a godly prison. Yet Cromwell was not only an enforcer, he was a visionary. He built a stronger navy, expanded trade, and pushed English power abroad. He crushed rebellions in Ireland and Scotland with brutal force, leaving scars that endured for centuries. Under his iron grip, England grew stronger, though not necessarily happier. And here lies the paradox. In trying to escape monarchy, England had created a new kind of king. Cromwell never wore a crown, but his portrait was painted, his speeches printed, and his authority carried the weight of divine destiny. When Cromwell died in 1658, the Republic unraveled quickly. His son Richard lacked the will and authority to rule. Parliament squabbled, factions rose, chaos spread. And by 1660, England did what once seemed impossible. It invited the monarchy back. Charles II, son of the executed king, returned from exile to reclaim his father's throne. But picture the irony. A republic that began with a king's severed head ended with another king riding home in triumph. Bells rang, crowds cheered, London rejoiced. The Commonwealth, for all its bold promise, had lasted barely a decade. Yet its legacy endured. The execution of Charles I had shattered forever the myth of divine right. Cromwell's rule haunted every monarch that followed. England had glimpsed a world without kings, and though it rushed back to the crown, it would never again see monarchy as untouchable. He breathed slowly, feeling the weight of this strange chapter. From the white mask of Elizabeth I to the sermons of James to the execution of Charles and now the Puritan Republic of Cromwell, each step was part of the same storm. Power, faith, and survival pulling England back and forth like a ship in rough seas. The candles in your imagination flicker lower. History has whispered its tale of kings who lost their heads and soldiers who became rulers. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you sense the quiet truth it leaves behind. No crown, no republic, no earthly power is ever permanent. All of it, like candle smoke, fades into the dark. Imagine England in 1660, after nearly 2 decades of upheaval, the beheading of a king, a fleeting republic, a fractured army, and endless quarrels in Parliament. The people were weary. They craved stability, pageantry, and rituals of the crown, and so they welcomed King back, Charles II, son of the executed monarch returning from exile. Picture the scene. A fleet of bright ships cutting through the channel toward Dover. Charles II, tall, graceful, full of charm, steps ashore to the thunder of cheers. Church bells ring across London. Flags snap in the wind, the air charged like a festival long delayed. They called it the Restoration. At last, England had a king again. But Charles II was no ordinary monarch. Years of exile in France and the Netherlands had steeped him in elegance and indulgence. In contrast to Cromwell's harsh austerity, Charles became known as a king of pleasure. His court glittered with music, theater, and grand balls. People called him the Merry Monarch. Theaters, once dark under Cromwell, now blazed with light. For the first time, women appeared on stage, no longer replaced by men in wigs and dresses. Taverns and coffee houses flourished, buzzing with politics, poetry, and rumor. London exhaled, as though holding its breath for years, now alive again. And yet, beneath the laughter, shadows remained. For all his wit and charm, Charles II could not escape uneasy questions. He was Anglican, yet close to Catholic France. He fathered many children, yet none legitimate to inherit the crown. And so, even amid music and wine, uncertainty about England's future lingered. Then came calamity. In 1665, the Great Plague swept through London, taking hundreds of thousands of lives. And in 1666, fire devoured the city itself. Narrow lanes ablaze for 4 days, tens of thousands of homes collapsing into ash. Imagine the terror, the smoke, the night sky lit as though by judgment itself. In those moments, Charles was more than a merry king. Stories tell of him helping lead the fight against the flames, tearing down walls alongside his men to stop the inferno. And so Charles II was a paradox made flesh, a monarch of delight, yet also a ruler tested by disaster. He restored laughter after Cromwell's shadows, but beneath the joy, seeds of new conflict were sown. English history is like a stage play, one act closing only for the next to open. Elizabeth hidden behind her white mask of lead, James lecturing endlessly about divine right, Charles I clinging to a throne that trembled above an abyss, Cromwell, stern and crownless, ruling with iron faith. And now Charles II, the merry king, standing on a stage still haunted by smoke and ruin. Take a slow breath. Picture the golden glow of London's reopened theaters, music rising into the night, and in the alleys beyond, the faint scent of smoke still lingering. History whispers that joy and sorrow, crowns and ashes, are always entwined, and it is in that weaving together that time leaves its weight. Imagine this. After years of pleasure and storms, the reign of Charles II slowly drew to a close. He was still the merry monarch, but age had cast long shadows. His romances and midnight revels made him famous, but also stirred criticism. And in the end, Charles II left no legitimate heir to carry on his line. Once again, the crown fell into uncertainty. The next in line was his brother, James, Duke of York, and here political tragedy began to stir, for James never hid his Catholic faith. In a land still haunted by the memory of the Gunpowder Plot, where even the mention of Rome stirred fear, a Catholic king was a nightmare come true. Charles, with his charm, tried to ease the tension. He kept James out of the spotlight, delayed decisions, and himself always appeared as an Anglican ruler. But time could not be stalled. As Charles's health failed, the question grew sharper. What would happen when he was gone? In 1685, Charles II died. They say that in his final hours, he secretly received Catholic rites, as though his whole life had been a struggle between two worlds. And with his passing, James ascended the throne as James II. His Judgment and Disaster movies reflect this to a T. Picture the mood. Some sighed with relief that the Stuart line continued, but many shivered. A Catholic monarch on Protestant England's throne was like a spark falling on dry tinder. James II soon proved he lacked his brother's finesse. He believed in absolute authority, believed in God's will, and believed his subjects must obey. He appointed Catholics to high office, promoted religious freedom for them, and drew closer to Catholic France, England's old rival. To James, it was justice. To his people, it was betrayal. Nobles feared their power slipping away. Clergymen feared the Church of England collapsing. Common folk whispered, "With a Catholic king, will we soon bow to the Pope?" And ship mounted until 1688, when the unthinkable happened, the Glorious Revolution. A group of nobles and MPs secretly invited William of Orange, husband of James's daughter Mary, to sail from the Netherlands and save England. When William marched his army in, something extraordinary unfolded. Nobles, officers, even James's own troops defected, leaving their king abandoned. Picture it, a lawful king in his palace, watching his soldiers turn away, realizing his people no longer stood with him. James II fled in panic to France, and the Stuart story veered sharply. The revolution was called glorious because bloodshed was minimal, yet its impact was immense. For the first time, Parliament proved it could remove a monarch and place another on the throne. William and Mary agreed to rule, but only after accepting the Bill of Rights of 1689, a charter that curbed royal power and placed true authority in Parliament. And so, after all the tragedies of Elizabeth, James I, Charles II, Cromwell, Charles II, and James II, England entered a new chapter: constitutional monarchy. The king still wore the crown, but no longer ruled unchecked. From here on, power belonged to law and to the people's representatives. You take a slow breath and see it clearly. Every mask has fallen. The white paint, the endless sermons, the bloodied axe, the feasts and revels, all were prelude to a single truth: absolute power cannot last. The candle in your imagination flickers out, and tonight, history whispers softly. Crowns may glitter, thrones may rise high, but in the end, only the limits we set upon power endure. And so we've traveled together through a long stretch of history, from Elizabeth's mask of white lead to James's long sermons, to the tragic fall of Charles, the stern figure of Cromwell, and finally, the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution. History, when you look closely, has never been a straight road. It is woven from masks that are worn and then discarded, from thrones that appear solid yet tremble in the wind. And within each tale lies a gentle reminder that power, beauty, and glory are only passing. What endures are the quiet lessons left behind for those who come after. Now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the steady hum of the fan the rhythm of your breath, and the soft echoes of history drift away into your dreams. May your night be calm, your sleep deep and restoring. And until the next story, rest well.